Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Nguyen, and I'm excited to introduce to you our guest today, Emily. She's sat on multiple boards and has worked in more than 20 countries to further diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DE&I. Emily has led and designed DE&I policies on national and global stages, including the United Nations. And after 10 plus years of working in the social sector, and she founded Forward Ever Global, an agency offering expert advice in social and organizational change. Emily combines her organizational development, global advocacy, and personal experience to increase the capacity of her coaching and consulting clients to engage in actions that increase DE&I, retention, and success for women of color and individuals of diverse backgrounds. So, if you're an aspiring leader or currently a woman of color in the leadership space, I would strongly recommend that you connect with Emily. Well, Emily, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Angela. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, to start off, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and what drew you to this niche and how did you ultimately discover your passion?
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, throughout my career, I've always had some element of women's leadership or gender equality work. I actually have a master's degree in women's and gender studies, and so that's always been true for me. Um, but in my last 9 to 5, I was actually working at a global labor organization and doing human rights advocacy, really with a focus on gender based violence and harassment in the world of work. So it was working with women around the world to really raise awareness about the violence that women experience at work, and then really strategizing around policy, around culture change, around the practices to really prevent that violence, but also to promote cultures of belonging and cultures of allyship. And so it was really in doing that work that brought me to where I am currently. And to get just a little bit more specific, I myself have experienced gender based violence and harassment in the world of work. And so while I was traveling, to multiple countries, giving trainings on, how do we strategize, right? How do we change things? How do we speak up in our workplaces? And often in places where actually the stakes are really high. And I had been on a 5 country tour and got back to my office in DC, and I realized, I too am experiencing this. So if I have been, to multiple countries, encouraging women to take a stand, to make a difference in their workplace, to advocate for themselves and other women, then I too have to advocate for myself and other women, other people of color. And that's exactly what I did. I eventually um, filed a claim of harassment and discrimination against my employer, and then represented myself in those negotiations. And I, received a life-changing settlement. So that's why I went into coaching women of color, because I want them to know that they have more than just two options, right? So oftentimes people think that if you're in a toxic work environment, either you suffer through it or you just quit and you just leave. Well, we can actually advocate for ourselves and create a lot of positive change when we do. And so that's what I coach women of color to do.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. I know it's not easy to, especially when there is a level of trauma that comes with an experience like that. And like, huge kudos to you for learning that self advocacy piece for yourself. Because, like you said, it's sometimes quote unquote easier to stay silent, step away because you don't understand what your options are, right? And based on your experience, what could have the organization done differently so it didn't lead to the outcome that it did? Did it start at the leadership level? Did it start at the policy level? Like, did you have a perspective from that end as well?
It was all of the above. It was a culture where um, that kind of treatment was accepted, right? It was like a very hierarchical place. It was also, in many ways, kind of like old school, traditional. And, this happens with a lot of organizations where if someone who is toxic or harassing people or making it really difficult for others, yet they're getting results, often companies will prioritize the results as opposed to the impact that that high performer has on others in the workplace, particularly women. And I would say that that was also true. Um, And I mean, I think the remarkable thing is that, we were able to come together as women of color, as people of color in the organization, and really make the case to say, hey, not everything is going okay here, right? And so, we are going to make some suggestions. And I would say, we did make suggestions. We made suggestions about policy, about culture, about leadership definitions and standards. And they adopted many of those, right? So that was part of the advocacy um, that I led, so it wasn't only for myself, but it was like everyone else, other women of color, other people of color, other people with marginalized identities. Let's all get together and talk about our experiences and then make some suggestions here, which the company did adopt many of them.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the company actually adopted some of the suggestions that you have, because a lot of times you might have employees say, "Hey, this is the problem," and then they bring a solution and the company was like, "Great, thank you." And then they turn the other way instead of saying, "You know what? Like, I hear you, I see you. Let's see what we can actually do about it," and continue to engage you, especially when you're experiencing it firsthand, right?
Mhm.
And like, what would you say are like attributes of a culture or a leader that promotes this type of environment where you can bring feedback and feel like you're heard and seen, and something's actually going to be done about it?
Yeah, well, hopefully we're trying to build the kinds of cultures where people don't need to do that, right? Because it's totally possible. And I help leaders do that every day. And I've done that myself in leading organizations. And so that's totally possible. So that's exactly what we should be aiming for. To your question, I mean, I think there has to be openness, number one, right? There has to be a recognition that not everybody has the same experience, right? Too oftentimes, leaders, executives, leaders in the top position, they don't spend enough time thinking about what the workplace um, feels like for their employees. So that's number one, right? That we have to acknowledge that everybody has a different experience in the workplace. Much of that is influenced by a person's identity. The other thing is that, you know, there has to be a willingness to change, right? There's been a lot of articles that have come out recently about what's been the result of all of this emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion over the last 3 years. And many of those reports say not enough, right? The statements were beautiful. Okay, we had a consultant come do a training, maybe two trainings, but there has to be a real willingness to change, right? It's not going to happen in two trainings. It's not going to happen because you have a beautiful statement. So to really acknowledge, like, okay, some things have to change, right? So that's, I would say, another aspect that's really important. And a third is that I would say that people really need to um, build a sense of community at work, right? Because if everyone's at odds all of the time, or you just don't know that person who's walking in the break room at the same time that you're leaving, it's going to make it really difficult to engage in a diversity, equity, and inclusion process that's actually effective in earnest, right? So we have to start to kind of like build those relationships in our workplace.
Love that that you gave like three different things to take into consideration. And when it comes to bringing this to the table with executive teams and everything, what would you say is one of their biggest dilemmas in buying into some of this? Because again, on paper, they're like, yes, logically this makes sense. But then, like you said, how come it's after two trainings that it's no longer in place, right? So there must be something that prevents them from continuing to carry on some of these behaviors that we're hoping to create, right?
Right. So I think it's a couple things. I think number one, I think it can be really hard at the executive level to really prioritize it, to really give it the time that it needs, because how do you get everyone to enthusiastically participate? That's a concern, right? The other thing I think is that it can be hard at the executive level to really know what steps to take, right? Like what actually do we need to have happen, right? That can be challenging as well. Um, and I think the third is really finding a great consultant. I think sometimes it's like, we see the people who are, all over LinkedIn, or they have like a great website, but it really is about the experience that a person has in leading diversity, equity, and inclusion effectively. I think in multiple organizational contexts, because just because, you're, let's say, a marketing agency, maybe your peer marketing agency brought in a consultant that worked very well for them, but it's not necessarily going to work well for you. So I think it really is kind of getting outside of the box, and finding the right consultant for your company, for your organization's culture, right? Not just stopping at, who has the most followers, or, has like the greatest visibility. They may not be the best person, right?
I think that's really great advice. And I guess for maybe a leader or an organization who is ready to engage a consultant or an agency like yourself, right? Like, what would you say are maybe one to three things that they should take into consideration to evaluate, like, okay, this is the fit that we're looking for, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think number one, make it a collective process. Anytime, an executive's trying to make a decision about what's going to work for the entire company, make sure that, the entire company is actually represented in that decision making, number one. Number two, you want someone who's going to be able to meet you where you are, right? And also be able to communicate a vision for where you want to be, right? And then I would also say, I mean, really looking at a person's experience, right? You know, having someone who has the depth of experience, has experience implementing successful diversity, equity, inclusion programs in multiple contexts is important, because that then shows that a person is versatile, and so they can, lead a dynamic process, which if you're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion right, it is going to be a dynamic process, right? And so I would say look for those things, and also look for creativity.
Love it. And I guess from an internal perspective as well, I know some companies have tried to take the approach of let's create employee resource groups. We'll have an executive sponsor, and hopefully through this approach, plus evaluating our policies, etc., that we will be able to create some positive change. But then at the end of the day, there's not enough engagement in the employee resource groups, right? So when you talked earlier about building community, finding the allies, like what are some things that you have found work to create an engaged employee resource group, essentially?
Well, I would say number one, I mean, the resource groups have to have budgets, and they have to have significant budgets so that they can actually, bring in good people or do the things that they need to do. So that's number one. Number two, you have to be able to carve some time out for the organizers, because otherwise it's just additional labor, right? And so, of course, engagement would be low if there's not a budget, so they can't actually implement their plans. And if they're not being compensated, but yet have to do the labor of coordinating, organizing, planning the agenda, implementing the meeting, finding the consultants or the speakers. I mean, yeah, that's it's actually counter to the overall point of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? We want people to feel a sense of belonging, to be able to be authentic, and to be able to succeed and thrive in any workplace culture despite their identities, right, or their backgrounds. And one of the major forms of discrimination that we see is additional labor, right, for less pay, right? I mean, that's the gender pay gap, for example. So when companies are looking to form employee resource groups as a means to increase engagement among people of color, women, people with other marginalized identities, then you have to make sure that you're not replicating those inequities at the very same time.
You just touched on something very key there, right? Because a lot, like, especially coming out of the pandemic, a lot of people are like, I actually enjoyed having some time back to an extent, right? When you don't have to like commute a lot, or sometimes like you actually end up working more because you're like, well, it's very easy to just turn around and log into my laptop or Surface Pro, right? So, do you notice if there is a trend in employers being more cognizant of, okay, like, let's not abuse some of these labors, not only from an employee resource group perspective, but also from like a workplace wellness, and just understand that people have a life outside of work, right?
I think that's probably one of the positive things that came out of the pandemic is that
Mhm.
there's much more awareness now that employers have to take into account employees' well-being and what matters to employees. I mean, that's really how we got here, is because employees got together and said, we will not stand for our companies, ignoring racial injustices that are just grave and unfolding before our eyes, right? And then the same is true with the Great Resignation. Employees said, we're not going to, a life is too precious, right? We're not going to run ourselves into the ground, sacrifice our well being, sacrifice our time with our families, sacrifice our social lives simply so that we can work and create results for the company. And then, in many cases, not be adequately compensated, right, for all the hours that we put in. So I have worked with a lot of leaders who willingly and happily embrace those new kind of norms, right? Or those new standards in the workplace. And that's wonderful, right? So I see a lot of changes around flexibility, around workplace culture, around employee input, right? All of those things are really important. And even for leaders who were not willingly there themselves, they've had to move in that direction because employees have demanded it, right? There were multiple executives who came out publicly to say that everybody's going back into the office, and then their employees actually said, no, we're not going to be treated that way, right? So
Right.
even employers who may not have themselves embrace the flexibility and the new focus on wellness have really had to move closer to that direction as a result of the pandemic and employee engagement in a different way.
And I love that you touch on that flexibility piece. And even then, I'm still like noticing a lot of organizations or articles coming out where they're like, well, you're more productive in the office or you're more productive X, Y, and Z. And I mean, I guess there should be more context provided than just a blanketed statement like that, right? But from just a woman of color's perspective or that diverse back of that visible minority, do you feel that they are losing out on a lot of talent? Because traditionally speaking, right, like growing up Asian, like you would show up no matter what, like even if you're sick, like that's just what is ingrained to you as a work ethic. But I think now more women are being like, wait, no, like I want time with my family. It's not that I'm lazy, it's just I want time with my family, right? So they're more willing to walk away from employers who don't have a level of flexibility, right? So when it comes to the DE&I practices, policies, and stuff that you're helping your clients with, are more leaders cognizant of that, or is that not even like a forethought in their mind?
Yeah, I see a little bit of awareness about that. I
Yeah.
do. And again, I see some executives who I work with are, asking fewer questions about when people get to the office or why they have to leave early, sending those reminders of, we know that you need to care for yourself or, anyone in your life, and we support that, right? So I have seen, at least the executives that I work with, I have seen them make those kinds of changes. Now, are we at the place where we're making the kinds of changes around pay equity? Right. I see that less and less, right? Or I see that less. And I think that, it's both workplace culture and then also pay for reasons why women are leaving the workplace and like opportunities for advancement. So if we can also get, on the radar of many executives focusing on pay equity and then also opportunities for advancement for women and women of color in particular, I think we'll see, in addition to that culture flexibility piece, I think we'll see, many more women of color enthusiastically in the workplace, as opposed to, leaving to start businesses, right?
How does one like start advocating for themselves too? Because like again, traditionally in a workplace, you're not supposed to talk about your salary, right? You're not supposed to know who the or how much that person across the street or across the cubicle is making in comparison to you. So how are you equipping your clients to be like, hey, actually, I feel like this is the value that I bring to the table?
I'm launching a course in July, actually, on this very question around negotiations for women of color, right? Which includes pay equity. And then it also just includes our labor in the workplace, because we see that women of color are often expected to do more work, or we're expected to do work in more difficult circumstances and situations. And so I have a course that's coming out in July to help women learn the skills of negotiation in these different contexts at work. Now, as it comes to um, advocating for pay equity, it's a nuanced question, right? And without knowing a specific woman's situation or a specific workplace, it's difficult to advise. However, I think it is important to be asking these questions of our employers and to first, take it for granted that you will negotiate, right? That's the first thing, right? So, I see too oftentimes clients tell me that they've never negotiated their salaries before, right? Well, we have to change that to, expecting to negotiate, especially after we've written the cover letter, submitted our resumes, gone through the interview process, right? That's like definitely time to negotiate. And you can ask your employer the pay scales for this, right? What's the range of people being compensated for people in similar roles, right? I mean, we can ask those questions, number one. And then, of course, you always have to do your own research, right? You may not be able to find exactly the information you need about that particular company, but you can certainly do some basic online research and find out what averages are, for by region, by position, by industry, all of those things. And so that kind of knowledge will really help one in advocating for pay equity.
I have so much appreciation for the fact that you're like, hey, one, do your research, and second, like, it never hurts to ask. The worst that you can get is, unfortunately, there's no room for negotiation. And then at that point, at least you have the option to be like, all right, I guess I'm either going to move on, or it's like, well, I guess we can at least evaluate from there, right? And if you grew up in a world where you were never encouraged to ask for a negotiation, because in a way it's like you're disrespecting that authority, I think is some of the common things that that comes to mind, I guess you could say, when asking for that. So how have you helped some women of color undo that train of thought then?
Yeah, that's why my negotiations course comes with group coaching, because it's in that group coaching setting that we can really unlearn those mindsets, right? Which so many of us have been taught, growing up culturally, right? Socialized as female, right? We learned all of these things, right? Don't be too much, don't ask for more, right? Um, and our workplaces reinforce it, right? This is where the imposter syndrome actually comes from. No, just that the pay gap exists in and of itself, right? And having knowledge of that can really cause one to second guess herself, when going to ask for money, right? If we, kind of perceive that we're going to be, encountering a disagreeable situation or rejection, that can be really intimidating. And we know that that's the case, right? Because so many of us have experienced, um, you know, um, have experienced that rejection, even when we're asking for things that are, lower stakes than salary, right? And so that's reinforced in the workplace. So it's common, it's logical to feel that way. And that's why we spend so much time in a coaching setting of unlearning, unpacking, and then adopting new thought patterns around that.
Amazing. And I guess on a personal level, like, what are some resources that have helped you to continue to essentially like check yourself and be like, okay, like, am I falling back into old patterns, or like,
Mhm.
are these the things that like I'm continuing to flex, so that, because it's a muscle that you ultimately have to flex a lot, right, for you to continue to exercise. So yeah, like, is it resources that you have available or mentors that you've found in your life that have helped you stay on track with that?
Mentors have definitely helped me stay on track, and help to encourage me, to keep striving. Coaches too. I mean, I've had my own fair share of professional coaches, where I've learned new skills from, or where I've really been pushed to stretch, right, and then I've grown. And also communities, communities of other women of color where I'm learning from them. I have their encouragement. I'm able to encourage them as well. Those are the kinds of things that actually helped me to keep moving forward, helped me to keep growing in my career, keep growing professionally.
And how does one start to find that community? Because I feel like when you are bombarded with so much, whether it's on your feed, at work, and yeah, like how do you find something that truly aligns with this is the community that I want to be part of? Like, how did you find yours?
Well, I think people should join my community. I mean, that's part of
Yeah.
all the programming that we do is
Yep.
community. And often women enjoy that part the most because not only are they having relationships, friendships, but then also that builds their professional network. So I would say start there. And I myself have done a lot of professional networking. That also has led to, finding those connections with other women of color that we then build a sense of community.
I appreciate that, and I'll definitely include the links in the like our description below. Like once we actually publish our conversation, and I guess to wrap up our conversation, I have two questions for you. So the first one is, what are you most excited about right now that you're working on, and that people can kind of keep an eye out on over the next couple of months?
Definitely the negotiations course. Yeah, I run weekly audio rooms on LinkedIn Thursdays nights, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we've been talking about negotiations for the last month and a half. And so I'm launching the course in July. It'll be for a small group of women. But it is really going to teach all of the skills that you need to become a powerful negotiator at work, right? And of course, when we learn those skills, they can also serve us in our personal lives. And so I'm most excited about that. There's been a lot of excitement about it. The women who have already joined the program are really awesome. And so I think that actually what I'm most excited about is to see what they do after they leave the program and have really mastered the skills. So that's what I'm most excited about.
Well, I'm excited to see the outcome as well and to follow the results. And like for those who like don't know, but you also published an article called Three Ways Self-Advocacy Makes You a Better Leader. I think that complements like the course that you're going to be offering and even like the microaggressions ebook that you have, right? So you have a lot of incredible tools out there that I encourage people to take a look at.
Mhm.
And then I guess my very last question for you is when it comes to unleashing the potential of both an individual and an organization,
Mhm.
what would you say are maybe three things that an organization should take into consideration so that, again, we can unleash both the individual and an organization's potential?
Have to lean into your people, you know? Just because someone's an executive or at the top of the hierarchy doesn't mean that they have all the answers, right? It's really important to lean on the people who are there, who are doing the work day in, day out, lean on their expertise, on their insight, on their perspectives, and provide a lot of opportunity for them to give feedback. And then, sometimes you have to bring people from the outside in, right, to help shake things up, to help, reveal things that maybe weren't seen from the inside, right? That also helps growth and forward movement.
Well, thank you so much for your time and just sharing your expertise, Emily. I really, really appreciate it. And like I said, I really encourage everyone to go and take a look at the resources that you have put out there. But on top of that, the course that you will be offering, because at the end of the day, like you said, negotiation is a skill that will benefit you in any area of life, not just in the workplace, but it will empower you much, much more than you otherwise would have imagined, right? In advancement and everything. So again, thank you so much, Emily, for your time. And I'm excited to stay connected and see what you'll do with your course there.
Likewise, Angela, thank you.